Welcome everyone to the Men Engage Ubuntu Symposium. We are very excited for the session today. What's emotion got to do with it? Facilitating gender transformative work with men and boys. Just to let you know, if you would like to follow the broader comms for the symposium or to, of course, hashtag anything from this session. I'm sure there will be so many critical contributions shared that we will want to amplify, right? Globally with hashtags, you may do so here. And thank you so much. I stopped there and pass it over to Amanda, Anne, and Doris. I'm really looking forward to the session. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. Glad you could join us. As we heard, today's session is called "What's Emotion Got to Do with It? Facilitating Gender Transformation with Boys and Men." And if for those of you who haven't done so already, please say hello in the chat box. Type in your name and which city you're dialing in from today. Our session is scheduled for 2 hours today. And we'll start with introductions. We'll start by introducing ourselves. And I think I'll ask Amanda to start.
Thanks, Doris. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Amanda Keddy, and I live in Victoria, Australia. I'm from Deakin University, and I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm speaking from unceded Aboriginal lands, from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I've been researching issues of gender and education for a long time, and more recently I've been really interested in exploring the emotional intensities of facilitating this work. I'm really happy to be here today with you.
Okay. And good morning, everyone. My name is Anne. It's really exciting to see who's here and to see that people are still joining. I live in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., and want to acknowledge that I live on the unceded ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. I split my time currently between accompanying gender transformative processes and then also working locally here in D.C., providing trauma therapy for gender-based violence survivors. And it's really in that context of increasingly bringing a body-centered lens to healing and resilience that I've gotten quite curious about what this might contribute to our work as facilitators of gender transformation. And Doris?
Yes, my name is Doris Bartel. I'm an independent gender consultant and social change evaluator. I'm currently also based outside of Washington, D.C. I live just a few miles away from Anne. So I also pay my respects to the Piscataway elders and ancestors, past, present, and emerging. I've spent more than 20 years working with communities and co-creating strategies for gender justice. And in the last few years, I focused on evaluating the strength of social movements. I know the passion that social activists bring to their work, and I'm interested in learning more about how emotions play a key part in the journey and change process for individuals and communities and movements. So that is our
we just wanted to mention our positionality and that we are very self-conscious and self-critical of our position as three white women from Anglo-Western cultures. We want to acknowledge our blind spots and the privileges that they imply. Our work is feminist and anti-racist and focuses on social justice. And we think of our work as in progress. We try to frame our work by an ethics of openness, of listening and learning. And as facilitators more broadly, we wish to advocate for an ongoing critical, self-reflective approach to all that we do.
Thanks, Amanda. So what's this session about? We designed this session for people who work as facilitators in programs that support gender transformation. As facilitators, we recognize that we often don't give enough attention to the emotions in the room. So for today's session, together, we hope to increase our awareness of emotional intensities that come up while facilitating these group discussions about gender and power. and consider the critical affective literacy framework as a tool to frame and explicitly identify and reflect on the emotional intensities in our work, and to apply the critical affective literacy framework to our experiences and reflect on its usefulness today. So our agenda is divided into 4 sections with a stretch break in the middle around the 1 hour mark. First, we'll focus on a couple of stories that came up in group discussions, stories of emotional intensities. We'll talk through 2 stories. And we'll have a little bit of time for small group breakout discussions about those stories, and then we'll do a little reflection back in plenary as a group. And then we'll walk through the critical affective literacy as a framework and explore that a little bit. And then in the 3rd section, we'll apply that framework to our own facilitation work, first through some small group breakouts, and then back in plenary again before we wrap up at the end. So that's our agenda for the day.
Yeah, and in terms of the agenda, I want to note that probably around an hour in, we're going to be taking a short stretch break. So that is something we are committed to giving us all a moment to do. But in terms of just getting to briefly know at the start here who's sharing this virtual space, we wanted to go to gallery view for everyone. And I don't know if folks are going to feel comfortable doing this or not. If you feel comfortable taking off your camera, that is great. And if you don't feel comfortable taking off your camera, we also respect that. So do whatever feels most comfortable to you. And for those of us who have the camera off, you'll be able to see our body or hand movements as we go through this really short exercise, and invite everybody to participate from wherever you are, whether you have your camera on or off. And so we just thought it might be helpful to consider together 3 different questions, and our responses we're going to give. We're going to use our hands. I think some of us may have facilitated vote with your feet, where people actually line up from not very much to a medium agreement with a statement to a very high agreement. And so we're just going to use our hands to sort of mark where we are in relation to these statements. And so I hope this makes enough sense. We'll try to model it. So the first question is just, how much experience do you have facilitating discussions about gender in a group, going from whether you would say not very much experience at all to tons of experience? So if you feel able and can bring your hands up to show relatively how much experience do you feel like you have facilitating? Yeah, thanks, folks. Gender in a group, gender transformation. All right, I'll let our hands go down for a second. The second question is, in terms of experiences of facilitating discussions of gender in a group, or being in discussions in a group about gender transformation, how often has there been intense emotion showed by one or more participants? And so this would be not very often has intense emotion appeared. A lot of times intense emotion appears, and sort of somewhere in between. Yeah, okay, so that is sense. Thanks, sort of a range. Thank you, everyone. And then our third question is, how routinely do you yourself, or do we ourselves individually, reflect on our own emotions or others' emotions as a core component of the gender learning journey? And let me say this again, because there's a lot going on in this statement. How routinely do you reflect on your own emotions or others' emotions as a key component of the gender learning journey? Yeah, okay, so a range. Some people a fair bit, some of us, including myself, probably less. All right. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that and considering those questions as a starting point to our time together. And so we're going to go back to the PowerPoint slide. And we thought it might be helpful for me to myself just to take a moment to share a little bit of reflection on my own journey with emotional intensity. I'm one of the people who just put her hands up as here in terms of not having spent an awful lot of time reflecting on emotional intensity in my work as a facilitator. And so just wanted to open up, as I've been thinking more explicitly about this, some of the layers of facilitation work that it's starting to call my attention to. And as I've started to reflect, I can identify a lot of experiences where there's been pretty intense emotional intensity, and thought that I would share really just one of them, which is an early one of facilitating this exercise of inviting participants to position their bodies on a spectrum in terms of agreement or disagreement with different statements. And early on, I can remember being super excited and having like positive emotion in my body and affected about facilitating this activity, about being able to be with people, hear many voices, have bodies and experiences in the room, see people moving and talking. And then all of a sudden, intensity really showing up as people started to talk more and more, talk intensely back and forth to each other, volume increasing, emotion increasing. And as I think back on this very particular moment, as a facilitator, I really strongly remember saying, like looking at my watch and saying, well, it is wonderful that there are so many strong opinions in the room. We're going to need to leave it here in the interest of time and move on to our next session. And so essentially in the face of that, sort of pausing and cutting off any further discussion. And when I start looking at this story now more through a somatic awareness of what was happening in my body and bringing in attention to emotions, I start seeing a couple of different layers, one of which that in my own experience, and perhaps in other people's experiences, but in my own experience, that I was really feeling a fair bit of anxiety, that things were seeming out of control to me emotionally, and a fear that I might be looking incompetent. I can feel a certain tightness in my stomach, a shallowness of my breathing, and then a starting of sort of like almost a freeze and moving away from the experience of facilitating in that moment. And looking back in on this and starting to think about where some of those patterns may be coming from, there's certainly, I appreciate links with my own personal history. I think looking in on that now about really at that moment, how it linked to being a then quite young female facilitator and feeling like very afraid of what it would look like as a young woman to not be appearing in control in a certain way of my emotions and others' emotions. And then more recently, in the context of some of my exploration and engagement with wonderful scholarship of people like Resmaa Menakem, who is looking at embodied patterns of white supremacy and racism, I've also begun to explore how a certain freeze response in my body, it may in fact be linked to longer term bodily patterns of white people in terms of freezing in the face of emotional discomfort and racism as a way to sort of check out and not be present to what is happening. So I share these just to be able to offer a brief reflection from my own perspective of what's starting to track emotions and bodily sensations can open up in terms of an invitation to be able to be with discomfort, to be expand capacity to be with discomfort, and to do that to become more aware for myself of what might be happening with myself and in the room, and have an expanded range of options to be able to respond in different moments. So with that, that's also part of why I was very excited to learn about Amanda and Doris's work on the critical affective literacy framework as a way in to really even more specifically supporting us as facilitators to start exploring this more directly. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Anne. It's a wonderful story. So we're going to share with you today two stories of emotional intensity. One is from Theo and the other one is Damien. They were generated as part of two research projects. They both sought to explore gender-transformative approaches to fostering inclusive and healthy masculinities. So Theos Story is from a project I conducted in the US in 2018 with an organisation involved in community work to support disadvantaged boys and young men. And Damien Story is from a current project where I'm working with colleagues to develop a bank of facilitator stories to support facilitators' critical reflection on their own practice. Both projects involve semi-structured interviews to explore with facilitators some of the critical moments in their facilitation that highlighted some, complexities, some stories of good facilitation and some stories of perhaps complex facilitation and discomforting facilitation. The participants tended to be young, under 35, and from a range of ethnicities. And we decided to present Theo and Damien's stories today because they really highlight some of the issues that we're trying to bring to light for you. So I'll just read those two stories. The first one, as I said, is Theo's story. And then later on, we'll have time to analyse them. So Theo is an experienced facilitator in his late 20s. He's a cisgender African-American male. And he provided an account of his approach to teaching young men about sexual consent. When one of his participants said that a woman removing her clothes constitutes consent for sex, he asked the group the following. I said, "Let me ask you this question. Who has access to your body?" The room got quiet. I said, "Let me ask it again. Who has access to your body?" They just started to light, like there was a light bulb that went on. They're like, "Well, I do." I was like, "Okay, your body. So who has access to your partner's body?" They said, "She does." So with that being said, I had to go back around the room and let them know. I was like, only you have access to your body. It's a privilege for someone to give you access to their body. And if at any time you decide you don't want to, that this is not what you want, you have every right not to do it. And that was a light bulb moment for them. So that's Theo's story. The next one's Damien's story. So Damien's a novice facilitator. He's an Anglo-Australian cisgender male in his mid-30s working with young males in Australia. He spoke of the nervousness he felt trying to facilitate discussions about sexual consent with a group of young males. He described not being comfortable with the material, which meant that he read from his notes and tried to get through the information as quickly as possible. The material reminded him of two previous occasions when he experienced some uncertainty about consent in his own sexual relationships. He wondered whether he should be doing this facilitation work. He relayed a story about one of these discussions when he tried to retain his self-control and hide his feelings of anxiety, but the boys just kept getting bored and restless. And Damien ended up getting angry with them and telling them to listen, but they got even more restless and disrupted. Finally, he lost his composure and yelled at them, and they were stunned into silence. So those two stories are going to be pasted in the chat box for us. Oh, they have been already. So Doris,
Great. Yeah, thanks.
hand it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, we just have a few minutes available to do some small group breakout work. And we'd like you to, in your small groups, have some discussions and some reflections on either one or both of these two stories. And we'd like you to think through some of the questions that we've put into this slide and Anne's put into the chat box too. What stood out for you in these stories? What emotions do you see circulating in these stories? How do these stories relate to your own emotions as a facilitator? And how have you managed the emotions circulating in the room, either your own or in that context or for the participants? So you'll have 15 minutes. We'll give you 15 minutes in the breakout rooms. Our tech support will randomly put you into groups of 3. We'll try to give you a little bit of a warning towards the end, so you have some chance to wrap up and come back. And we'd love to hear from the breakout rooms when we come back to plenary, as we discuss this in plenary. So just take a moment while you're in your groups to think through kind of what you might want to share back with the rest of the room. The small groups won't be recorded. And if you feel uncomfortable being in that breakout room for any reason, just come back to the plenary. So I think with that, any other instructions? I think we can let people go into their breakout rooms.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tamsin.
Welcome back when you get here. Hope you had some good discussions. So at this point, we have a little bit of time for some reflections back from the small groups on some of the questions that we had about these 2 stories. And there's 2 ways that we can reflect in a bigger group like this. You could just unmute yourself and speak, or if you feel more comfortable, you can just type some message about your reflections from your group into the chat box. So I'll start with the first question. What stood out for you in these stories? Maybe I'll just go to the second question while we're at it. What emotions are circulating in these stories? Is there any reflections from anybody on those?
Yeah, I saw Sarah's hand up. I don't know if I saw anyone else's hand. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to answer the first bit.
Sure.
That it was very simple, the way that Theo, it was a simple question that started the change, just one question. But as Sophie in our group said, he handled the silence and then re-asked the question. So the importance of the silence and letting it be. And then how quickly that they changed their responses and their thought processes. And then on the second one, about the sort of his insecurity and not being comfortable with perhaps the fidgeting and the slight disruption, and then losing control because he's feeling insecure. So important to manage your own emotions. But the other ladies are far more experienced than me, so I shall hand on to them at this point.
Anybody else?
Anna Kit has shared in the chat that silence, sort of building on what you shared, Sarah, that silence was an underlying theme in both the stories, but the reasons for the silences in both were so different.
Yeah, well said. What struck me about what both of you have said is you're commenting not just on the emotions of the individuals in the room, either the facilitators or the participants, but also it speaks to the second question about how the emotions of the group actually play a role in how that session goes, the mood in the room, the context of those emotions. All right, let's maybe we can move to the next one. How do these stories relate to your own emotions as a facilitator? Anybody else want to share? I can't see the hands, so Anne, you'll have to tell me if somebody's got their hands raised.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Sophie.
Sophie. Yeah.
Sophie.
Yes, Sophie, I don't know if you're muted or not, but we'd love to hear your reflections.
I think we might need some tech help to help
There we
Sophie
go.
unmute.
I'm sorry, it wasn't allowing me to unmute, but now I think I'm in.
Okay.
Yeah, in our group, we were just saying that, you could really empathize with Damien, especially, like Anne, when you were sharing your story, I have similar stories of especially starting out and kind of the anxiety that comes with public speaking for a lot of us, and then being magnified when your role is not just to speak, but also to kind of hold a process and create a container and hold emotions of what's happening in the room. It can be, really tricky. And you kind of see Damien's, when I was hearing Damien's story, I was like, oh no, like you kind of feel it just unraveling and falling apart as it goes. And in a way that's very relatable, I think, of the silence being so unnerving. And the more there's the silence or the disruption and people aren't kind of validating you as a facilitator, and then it's tapping into your own insecurities. And yeah, so that really resonated for me. And then with Theo, just this example of being able to really attune to the room and kind of feel that moment, that there is a potential moment where if you just ask the right kind of personal question, and holding that silence, like we were just talking about, in a way that then enables folks to step into it and to be courageous and to participate, and then what kind of transformation is possible, or deepening is possible from that kind of bravery in his facilitation. So yeah, there were great stories.
Thanks, Sophie. I really appreciated how you talked about courage and bravery. There's a lot of personal stuff. Emotions bring up a lot of personal stuff, and vice versa. So yeah, it takes some extra effort. Anybody else?
Aniket here.
Hi, Aniket.
Hi.
Go ahead.
So I'm not aiming to answer any particular question here, but I think as I've been in a similar situation couple of times where students want to ask a lot of questions related to a lot of the topics that are considered taboo, or a lot of the topics that generally teachers don't talk about, like 13-14-year-olds want to know about condoms, about sex and all these things, which are not really a part of the curriculum that we go to the schools with. So primarily we work in schools, and we have the curriculum we have doesn't pertain to these topics, because it is not a sex education kind of a syllabus. But so in that case, I think what couple of things that stand out are, one is definitely your comfort with the topic that I also struggled with, because it was my early days as a facilitator. But also another thing that does strike out is our knowledge on these things, because when you have the knowledge that is required in these situations, it is also easier for you to convey it, because these are 12-13-year-olds that we are talking about in my case, and it is kind of difficult to convey these things when you don't know what their understanding of these things is. So I think these are two things that I think come up as obstacles when dealing with these topics for me personally.
Thanks, Aniket. Yeah, I think what we're hearing from folks is that the scenarios of the stories are resonating with people's personal experiences, and I think in particular I'm hearing a lot of resonance about our own emotions as facilitators, and thinking about what that means and how to use that better to become better facilitators. I think we have one more question, but and I think we just have a couple more minutes. How have you managed the emotions circulating in the room, either your own or the participants? Any reflections on that from your small group discussions or your personal reflections? Anybody want to share?
Sarah, go right ahead. Thanks.
Dominique, I wonder if you will forgive me for sharing your lovely story. I hope that's okay.
Go ahead.
Dominique said she wasn't so confident in English, although her English sounds very good to me. She said when things are emotional, that she sometimes says, you know, she doesn't cry even though she feels like crying, but she says, I feel your pain and I want to cry with you. So she just puts it into words instead, which sounded the loveliest way to say it.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
I think someone else has their hand up.
Do we have another hand?
Yeah. It doesn't have your name on it, so there's someone with their hand up.
Yeah, it's me again.
Oh, hi, Annika.
Hi. Yeah. So I think, one thing about this question is that often, what I've experienced is often there are not a lot of emotions surfacing in a group full of boys, and that is something that has been difficult to crack as well for us, because we would want boys and young men to really speak their heart, really speak their mind. That has been a challenge, but apart from that, I think what we, not just me personally, but as an organization, we always come down to is empathy. And we always encourage students to think about how they would feel if in the they were in the shoes of whoever is maybe say feeling bad or not in a comfortable position. It is always good to remind them of empathy that we talk about as a value in the very first session, that we should try and keep throughout our interactions. So I think that's one way that we try to go about it, and it's not something that I would say always works, but that's one way to go about it.
Thanks, Annika. Yeah, we don't have time today to go into the gender factors of what people feel or how people express their feelings, and I think that's another session that I would love to have a chance to talk through at some point. So thanks for bringing that up. Actually, we have the next session is kind of talking a little bit about affect. And I wonder if we should start moving into that direction. Does anybody else have any things that they want to say? Oh, is there anybody else that has a comment or a question before we move on to the next session?
Yeah, I can just read a couple of the chats.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Sophie wrote, I really appreciate bringing empathy in as an explicit value. Annika, thank you. And Dominique also wrote, the best way for me is to recognize the emotions and say it is normal to feel them.
Thanks. Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'll turn this back to Amanda then, and then after Amanda goes through affect, we'll take a little break.
Yeah, it's good that actually the CAL framework includes empathy. That's one of the key principles. But just before we move on to have a bit of a break, I just thought I would explain to you a little bit about affect theory. We don't have the time and space to really explore it in any great depth. Suffice to say, it's a very complex and wide-ranging field, and it's informed by different genealogies of theory. In relation to masculinities and gender studies, though, it's been a really important new way of, or an enriched way of understanding and thinking about bodily, emotional, cognitive, and sensual intensities of gender justice issues. And that's the way I've found it really enriching for my work. But broadly speaking, it's affect is theorized as the capacity to affect and be affected. It's a category that encompasses emotion, feeling, desire, and impulse. And as Sarah Ahmed's work beautifully illustrates, emotions are not something that we possess. They circulate and move. Their intensity of force and flow affect bodies, relations, and context. And the stories, I think, illustrate that. So psychological understandings of emotion and affect would see emotions as something we can possess and individualize. Sociological understandings are sort of outside the body, but this is an understanding of how the emotions circulate as a force and flow, and they attach to particular bodies. So it's an exciting sort of loosening up of the way we think about emotions, feelings, desires, impulse. And now we have a short break. Doris, did you want to say anything?
No, just to say this is your chance to take a little bit of a break, a bio break, a stretch break, grab your favorite beverage. We'll come back in 5 minutes. It's, according to my clock, it's 5 minutes before the hour. So can we start again right on the hour mark?
Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome back, friends. Thanks for being active participants in this webinar. Amanda, I think we can get started.
Okay. Oh, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I just went really quiet. Oh, I'm by myself. So on the next couple of slides, we're going to present the Critical Affective Literacy framework. And I guess emotions have been part of the curriculum of, generally speaking, of gender transformative programs with boys and men, but facilitators rarely get to critically reflect on their own emotions in this work, which can, of course, be highly discomforting, as we saw with Damien's story. So our view is that critical reflection is very important. It's not about trying to identify emotions in order to control them in our work, but contemplating, as Anne really illustrated beautifully, contemplating how it affects ourselves, our work, and our relations with others, how we feel, how it affects our body, how it affects the room, how it affects how we interact. And so we think these principles are really helpful in helping us to really work through and understand and use our emotions in enhancing our work. So the first principle is examining why we feel what we feel. So if we have a look at Damien's story in relation to these questions, we can ask, what is he feeling? And we can see that there's feelings of anxiety, uncertainty, and in the end, anger. And we can postulate as to why, and with some of our comments earlier kind of alluded to that. So he was discomforted with the material and the topic. He might have been ill prepared for the session, and he was also triggered by some personal questions about his own conduct in previous sexual relationships. So this is all going on in his mind as he was facilitating, and it's really affecting himself and also the room. So the question of what the emotions in this situation do is a really important one. So we can see that the emotions of anxiety, uncertainty, and anger, they circulated in the context of facilitation to prevent or shut down important gender conversations. In fact, the boys were stunned into silence. So what we think this principle of the framework supports facilitators to critically reflect on are the 3 points we've got here, which is the aspects of gender transformative work that incite strong emotions. So looking at those different areas that you do feel discomforted with, or that you feel joy at exploring. And then looking at why and how that you feel these emotions, and then what they actually do. Do they make you excited? Do they make you recoil? Now, principle 2, I'm really glad someone brought up empathy, because I think that's a really key pedagogy. As an educator, I use the word pedagogy, but key strategy that is really important in gender transformative programs. And it really asks, this principle is about striving to enter a relation of affective equivalence, which in normal speak, it's quite a complex way of putting it, but how can we imagine standing in the shoes of others? What might this mean for understanding their suffering? And I really love Judith Butler's work here, because she argues that our responsiveness to the suffering of others is conditioned on how their lives are presented to us. Some representations of suffering are legitimized, while others are not. For example, I've done some research in schools where girls' experiences of sexual harassment have been trivialized and minimized. A staff member, for example, on hearing some of these reports of sexual harassment, quite serious reports from girls, said, oh, they're just being drama queens. So it's an example, that's an example of these girls suffering not presented as legitimate. In contrast, we can see in Theo's story that he presents the suffering of women who are subject to sexual misconduct as legitimate. The boys are invited to consider the sexual consent issue from the women, from the young women that the boys associate with. So Theo's questions around bodily access encourage the boys to recognise and value bodily autonomy, the bodily autonomy of their sexual partners. That is, their autonomy to permit or not permit access to their bodies at any time, regardless of whether they've removed their clothes or not. So we've written a few dot points here. We think that this principle supports facilitators to critically reflect on how they teach for empathy. And in how they're teaching for empathy, how do you represent the suffering of others? And that could be on any sort of issue around race, around whiteness, around gender, around ableism. How is that represented? And what is the implications for how we understand different forms of suffering? So moving to the two remaining principles. Principle 3 is about interrogating the production of emotion in everyday politics. So this is a principle that involves examining the politics of emotions, so how emotions are produced through everyday politics. And that might relate to the power dynamics in how we relate to each other in various contexts like this work, school, within the media, family, community. So it's those dynamics. So if, for example, it might ask how emotions such as anxiety or embarrassment or fear about gender and masculinity are created and circulated. So just to exemplify, in Theo's story, this principle might involve examining the emotions associated with familiar gender discourses where men are expected to initiate sexual encounters, and more broadly, how they're expected to control and dominate in their relations with others, those expectations. Not all men obviously do that, but there's those broader discourses that we're all familiar with. But it would involve unpacking the affective intensities of, for example, desire and shame associated with anxiety around not living up to a particular version of masculinity, and how that might differ in particular contexts. So it's looking at the emotional intensities and how they're different in different contexts and different relations. And it would be involve exploring what these emotions do to men's bodies in these different contexts, how they're experienced bodily. So do they recoil or do they lash out, for example, when they feel shame about a particular instance, I guess, in terms of not living up to a particular masculinity. So that's principle 3, and we think that will support facilitators to critically reflect on how gendered messages circulate through everyday politics in ways that generate a specific emotional response. And the last one, principle 4, is obviously a really important one, and that's focusing on how our emotions become mobilized for social justice. How can what we say and feel become what we do? How can we channel emotions productively for social justice? So there are strong emotions and positive ways that are strong emotions are mobilized for social actions and solidarity for gender equity. But the emotional discomfort that boys and men can experience in relation to, say, being challenged about their unearned advantages, that can produce alienation and resistance, and that can actually work in really unproductive ways in terms of social activism. Men's rights groups, for example, there's lots of strong emotions there, but that's a really inequitable kind of way in which strong emotions are channeled. And then you've got boys and men working with feminist groups and feminist causes and marches, and that's an example of a way in which those emotions are channeled productively for gender equity and gender justice. And a lot of programs for men and boys, well, some of the ones that I've been familiar with, have as part of their curriculum involving boys and men in activist work to support women and girls, which is this principle. So these are the 4 principles.
Amanda, I just wanted to note, I think Winnie had their hand up, and I don't know, Winnie, if you wanted to comment or ask a question about what Amanda was sharing. All right. Well, what we thought would be useful to do now is to have a chance to be in groups again. And with the benefit of the framework that Amanda has shared with us, to dive a bit more into the first principle. We're very interested in all of the principles, and especially how they might apply to and sort of open up spaces in your facilitation work and your reflections on that. But for today, we're going to focus now just on the first principle, which is, why do we feel what we feel, and what do emotions do? And so we have a few questions to be considered in the group. And I don't know if we can get those questions up on the slide here. I think it needs to be a couple more clicks to see them. And then I think Doris is also going to paste these into the chat box, so when you're in groups, you have reference to these questions. But the questions here are, when and under what circumstances have particular strong emotions surfaced? And so it's an opportunity to think about, based on your experiences, are there particular content, topics, dynamics among participants, particular types of situations that are linked to strong emotions? An opportunity to discuss a bit further, what are these emotional intensities that tend to surface linked to these situations? And then perhaps to be able to take a moment to investigate a little bit further, what do these emotions do in terms of what they, in terms of first how they're experienced. And it might not be time to address all of the emotions that you surface, but maybe take a couple that are of interest and consider, based on your experience, how do they show up? And perhaps attending to some of these multiple dimensions of affect, in terms of what are the emotional feelings, what might be accompanied in terms of bodily sensations, either for yourselves or for what you're noticing among others in the room, sort of impulses, types of directions that either bodies and or energy is moving, and other thoughts. So this is an opportunity to sort of take these dimensions of affect and say, how are certain strong emotions that show up experienced? And then reflecting a bit on their impact on facilitator context and participant context, and what's happening in a situation. And then a little bit about what do they do in terms of creating blockages or boundaries, shutting things down, or opening spaces up. So we're going to take about 20 minutes in groups to be able to work through these. And we will then come back and share out what it was like to reflect in this way. And again, if in your groups, you can think about if one person might be prepared as well to be able to share any reflections. We'll really look forward to hearing those. So I think those are all of the sort of setup for the groups. Is there anything else, Doris or Amanda?
No, just one more thing. Given how many people we have in the room, I'm wondering if we shouldn't go for groups of 4.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I don't know if our tech person, Tamazan, if you can divide us so that we end up with groups with four people in each group. Is that what you're thinking, Doris?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be great. So we will go to groups now, and then we will rejoin in about 20 minutes. Welcome back as folks are rejoining. So yeah, we just wanted to have a chance together, reassembled, to do a little bit of reflection about what this experience was like for you, and maybe starting again with any reflections on what stood out for you in your discussions and sort of how it was to be engaging in this sort of reflection. So not sure if there's anyone from any of the groups who want to share a little bit about what stood out in your group's discussion. And I myself am not seeing hands. So if somebody wants also to share, you should feel free to just come off of mute and voice whatever you might be considering that you'd like to share.
Also, feel free to just type into the chat box.
I don't know whether this would be something to reflect on, but one question related to what stood out is whether there were any patterns to the type of situations in which particularly strong emotions surfaced. I didn't know whether in small groups you all noted any sort of types of content or dynamics or situations when emotional intensity are more likely to be present.
I think I could talk for our group. Maybe if no one wants to talk, it was wonderful. So there were emotional intensities around the joy that stories of joy about a husband's transformation and from being someone who was violent and saw women as just being to sort of bear children to being respected, and the joy actually in the room encouraged the other women in the room to share their stories. So you could imagine that in that context that the affective atmosphere would be very positive, and it opened up the space. So that was, I think, a lovely story. And there was another story that we had of issues of transgender issues, bringing up some discomfort and confusion and hostility, and this person talked about the society as being quite heteronormative, and that there were kind of issues around that, and that tended to close down, I suppose, the conversation. And and we were sort of asking questions, okay, well, in that situation, what does open it up? If you've got that intense moment, what does open it up?
Yeah. No, and I appreciate you sharing the range of reflections from naming joy as part of emotional intensity, and then also really naming a specific context around heteronormativity and discomfort and how shut down things can become related to transgender experience and identities. And it sounds like maybe just sitting in, so acknowledging that, does that then create more space to consider what else could hold space and open things up a bit more? Yeah. Any other reflections that folks want to share about what stood out in the discussion? Maybe not. Was there someone who was coming off mic?
Sophie? I think so.
Yeah, I can share a bit, and then maybe Winnie and Doris, if there's things that I missed, you guys can help me. I think we kind of spoke about two different scenarios. The first was our experiences as facilitators when participants in the group are expressing really potentially harmful views or non-feminist patriarchal views, and how that can elicit a lot of anger, or it's like kind of that feeling of, for me, it's my face flushing when he talked a bit about becoming tense in her body, and how attuning to how our body is responding in those moments can give us like a little mini warning to take a bit more care in how we respond, like that it's a potentially kind of loaded moment and our own anger is there, very present. So just to, I mean, I don't know that I can say I do it successfully, but that's kind of the aspiration, I guess. And then we also talked about holding sadness and grief and, particularly working with survivors, if disclosures start coming out or, that kind of intensity of sadness and real emotion and how we can manage that as a facilitator and even whether the idea is more to keep the room calmer and quieter emotionally or whether to kind of invite those more intense emotions in. And we kind of, I don't know that we really concluded, but we felt that it was kind of complicated and depends on who's in the room and the kind of experience that you have as a facilitator and really your intention as a facilitator, whether you want to take the journey there or step back a bit.
Thank you for those reflections, Sophie. Yeah, and I'm thinking about, as you were talking, that value of and naming, attuning the impact of this on ourselves and opening up that attunement can potentially offer a space to know what's happening and to respond differently. And I also, as you were talking about holding the sadness and grief, along with the impact of receiving patriarchal intensities, etc. Just thinking also about the emotional intensity and impact of this work on us as facilitators, as well as your question of and reflections in your group of, and so what are some of the choices then about how to recognize or be with strong emotions like grief or sadness? So thank you for all of that. Yeah. One question I think we might move on to, and some of the comments have opened this up already, but is really reflections on how it is to bring this sort of more explicit lens to emotions. And this more explicit lens partly being principle one that we've been looking at, but also overall more explicit attention and being curious about, how useful it is, what a difference you're thinking it may make in terms of what you're thinking about or considering attending to. And it may be that some of that was already surfaced in terms of what was also already shared. In terms of starting to have questions about in these moments of emotional intensity, what are the range of options for how to respond and consider not having straightforward answers, but starting to think more about what would open things up or provide support in a given moment. And that, a lot of that also depending on a read of the room and also ourselves as facilitators and where we are. So maybe, go ahead, Amanda.
I was just saying, I guess in some ways, the framework provides a bit of a language for what we're already sense, I mean, as you were saying earlier, and with your story, it's not something we're very much aware of these kind of emotions and their impacts on our bodies. And I think in a facilitator space where you are positioned as the authority or expert, which is not really what it's supposed to be, but some, leaders might see it that way, is, you do tend to try and control and stifle and hold them back, which, may be appropriate in some situations, I suppose. And I don't know, you don't want to be an emotional mess, dissolve into this, But I guess what I'm saying, it gives you a bit of a language to think about and to, as heuristics tend to do, to think about the different kind of ways you might unpack the various areas.
Yeah. And I think following up, Amanda, on what you're saying, one of the one of the last questions we wanted to share and invite some reflection on is just sort of what else are you wanting to do, imagining doing around attending to emotional intensities, based on some of where we've been this morning in this session, and also, really asking this question, being aware that applying the critical affective literacy framework to work for gender transformation is a work in progress. It's new. So I don't know, Doris and Amanda, if you also want to amplify anything about this question, but I think it's really an invitation to sort of be like, so what else are folks thinking you might like to do around engaging emotions or not? And what else would you want to be able to support further attention to this, if this is something that's feeling of interest?
Mm.
And again, you can also certainly feel free to type into chat if that is also a more comfortable space to sort of share reflections on what else, sort of what next things that you might like to do or want to see addressed in future attention to emotional intensities and facilitation work. Yes, Sarah.
Thank you to the people who have shared. I think they're all so interesting. The thing about, I could see myself very much feeling that anger, the flushing that Sophie described, and thinking how you might, taking the pause to think about how you might, move on from that and explore further. Also the uncomfortableness that was mentioned in our group, talking about, trans issues, because, in South Africa, she was saying that the I'm sorry, I can't remember your name exactly. I need to look. I can't see your name. Oh, Non-Tombi. Sorry if I've said that incorrectly. She said people are more comfortable talking about homosexuality than perhaps transgender conversations, and people feel, this confusion, and sometimes it comes out as hostility. That was really interesting. There was one other that I've and Dominique talking about couples where the woman is pregnant, and how they come at a problem with such different viewpoints, and she feels it's because the man doesn't feel the change in the same way as a woman who's carrying the baby, and that was really interesting. But when I interviewed quite a lot of people in Rwanda for the dissertation that I did, and at the end of lots of the transformation stories, it was, now she is also happy. And it just kept coming out, and I just thought, if this is a journey together, and if that's what we want from our world, that now she is also happy, or now this person is also happy, that's just such a wonderful story. This is what the goal is. Now everyone's happy because we're all equal, or that's an end goal. Well, it's an end goal that everybody could buy into, because it's not going to make your life worse because she's happy. It's going to make your life better. Or if your friend who's gay or trans is treated with respect, their life is going to be better. And it's not going to impact negatively on your life. So I think, that was just my thoughts.
Thank you. And I find myself just really taking a moment to expand into what you're offering of emotion and happiness and well-being in that way is such a core, and I think for myself, often unnamed dimension of what the goal of gender transformation is. So I'm just feeling my own sort of emotions around that and taking a moment of space to absorb that. So thank you for saying that and sharing that, Sarah. Yeah. So I think maybe over to Doris and Amanda to wrap up, along with a question from Sophie, sort of along the what's next, saying thanks for sharing the framework. It's really valuable. And are there plans for applying it within programming or other training, which I think transitions to some closing thoughts.
Okay. So I guess this presentation really came out of kind of increasing awareness, I guess, of the emotional intensities of this work, but not only that, the significance of really critically reflecting on those intensities, acknowledging them and critically reflecting on them. And we believe that facilitators need better tools to actually support them to do this critical reflection. And that's why the affective literacy framework seemed to be quite attractive as an evolving tool to support us to do this self-reflexive work. Obviously, self-reflexive work is much broader than just on emotions. It's on identities, contexts, relations, content of the material, but we believe that the emotional dimensions or the affective dimensions of this work perhaps haven't been positioned with enough significance in the critical pedagogies that are central to gender transformative work. So this is why we present this framework. We're actually looking forward to further opportunities for co-learning around the framework in terms of its applicability for facilitators. The version that we shared is an early version, and it's not necessarily being related to the gender transformative context, but we want to explore its utility with gender transformative workers, and maybe do some research around the utility of the framework. So we'd be very interested if you are, and some of you might find that this framework could be useful in your work and that you're really interested in exploring it further. We would love it if you would email us, or maybe suggest some other people that might be interested in participating in some research around exploring the efficacy of the framework. And on the next slide, we have our details. No, not on that, sorry. On the following slide, I just wanted to share with you the reference for the paper that the presentation is. Sorry, it's nearly 2:00 in the morning and I'm losing my words. Sorry. So that the first reference is the paper that the presentation was built on, and I just loved working with you, Doris, on this paper. It was so great. So I want to thank you very much for working with me on this. The paper is not actually accessible unless you are a university academic and belong to a library. So if you want a copy of the paper, and Doris and I have written a 2-pager outline, please do email us, and we can send you the paper. And would you like to talk about the other reference there?
Yeah, I just wanted to share this reference from Reza Menachem called My Grandmother's Hands. And he's a somatic experiencing racial justice worker. And so I was drawing on his work related to some of my reflections on affective intensities and body patterns around white supremacy. His book is pretty available. And also if you Google his name, he has some really lovely talks in various spaces that you can access if this ends up being of interest to anyone.
And, on that note, just as a final wrap up, just to say, we really would love to be in touch with any of you as a follow-up to this presentation. Please do contact us. These are our contact details. Maybe somebody can just copy and paste them into the chat box so that people can have access to those if they're saving the chat. Yeah, we would love to have opportunities to do some co-learning and iteration on this framework in practical settings. So please do be in touch on that. Yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience together with you today. Thank you all for joining. We'd love to get some feedback on the session. If you have even 2 minutes, it really won't take long, but if you want to click on that link. Somebody can copy and paste that link to our very short feedback survey into the chat box so that people can give a little feedback on our session so that we can improve.
Yeah, I'm just trying to copy and paste right now. There are emails, and then let me try for the link and see if I can get it.
Should be able to just click on
Maybe Tommy Jean can do that for us, our tech support.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not able to get it off of the slide.
I want to just give a big thank you to all of you as participants for engaging with us on this topic and for being patient and understanding, and also sharing some personal histories and narratives about your experience as facilitators or in groups like that. It's just been a really wonderful opportunity for discussion and co-learning amongst such talented and experienced group facilitators. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.